in part 3 of the Discourse on Method using the nice Hackett edition here, and Descartes is giving his provisional code of morals. He's still sitting in the stove-heated room. In this edition, he started sitting there on page 9, page 7, top of page 7 at the beginning of part 2. He begins sitting and thinking in a stove-heated room, and he stays there all the way through page 16 towards the end of part 3. So he's coming up with a provisional code of morals. He's given his rules for a method of pursuing knowledge and getting rid of error, and he's not comfortable in thinking this will be complete until he can apply it to the very foundations of knowledge. That means doing some serious philosophy, and that's the stuff, the infamous method of doubt stuff that he'll get to in part 4 of the Discourse on Method, but in autobiographical terms, I think a full 9 years later. For now, he's giving a provisional code of morals that will have to serve him until he gets to do all that hardcore foundational philosophy stuff. And the provisional code of morals is very traditional, and those are the only two words you really should understand about it. Well, those are the two most important words you should understand about the provisional code of morals in part 3, that it's traditional and it's provisional. In part 6, we might get a new code of morals. Anyway, last video we looked at the first one. Let's look at the second one, and maybe we'll do more. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I could, and to follow the most doubtful opinions once I had decided on them with no less constancy than if they had been very well assured. He gives a nice illustration of a traveler who gets lost, and such a traveler, he says, should not wonder about turning this way and that, nor worse still stop in one place, but should always walk in as straight a line as they can in one direction and never change it for feeble reasons, even if at the outset it had perhaps been only chance that made them choose it. For by this means, even if they are not going exactly where they wish, at least they'll eventually arrive somewhere where they'll probably be better off in the middle of a forest. So once you make a decision, stick with it. Maybe it's wrong, but it's not going to do you any good to keep changing directions in life. Well, stick with it as much as possible. Even if it was not a certain decision, you better stick with it. And thus the actions of life, often tolerating no delay, it is a very certain truth that, when it is not in our power to discern the truest opinions, we must follow the most probable, and even if we notice no more probability in some than in others, nevertheless we must settle on some, and afterwards no longer regard them as doubtful insofar as they relate to practical matters. So action must always go past what knowledge can give us. Knowledge cannot give us certainty, or maybe I should say the evidence cannot give us knowledge, but action nevertheless must be taken, and so we must follow as if certain a decision once made, even if it was only probable and not certain. There are strong hints here of ancient skepticism in the ancient world, and I really don't keep much of this in my head anymore, but I think you'll find some of this stuff in some of the ancient skeptics, like Sextus Empiricus probably. So the idea is pretty straightforward. I say we move on to the next maxim. The first maxim was in the last video. The first maxim was to obey the laws and customs of my country and go along with what all the smart people in my culture say. Second maxim, be as firm and resolute in actions as possible. Follow even doubtful opinions consistently in action, if not necessarily in what I think is definitely true. My third maxim was always to try to conquer myself rather than fortune, and to change my desires rather than the order of the world. Now this is so traditional. This is pure tradition. This is 100% Stoicism and Boethius here. So if I let myself, I go off on a long tangent, giving a miniature lecture on Stoicism and then on Boethius. Let it suffice to say, the Stoics are the paradigmatic, at least in the ancient world. Things are a bit different in the East. You'd select Buddhism in the East. In the ancient Western world, the Stoics are the paradigmatic example of people who try to change themselves to achieve happiness rather than try to change the world. Conquer ourselves rather than fortune. Change my desires rather than try to change the world. That's the point of Stoicism. And you find a whole lot of this stuff in Christian medieval stuff like the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, where we're taught that fortune is not something we should stake our happiness on. Conquer ourselves rather than fortune. That's very, very Boethius there. Now, in Boethius, you're still supposed to desire God. Ultimately, Boethius is basically an Augustinian. But there's a lot of connections to Stoicism in Boethius, and indeed in Augustine. Conquer yourself rather than fortune. That much is, I would think, more or less a total agreement between Stoicism, Boethius, and Augustine. In Descartes, but remember this is only his provisional code of morals, he says, there is nothing that is completely within our power except our thoughts. Now that is what you will find at the beginning of the Enchiridion, or the handbook of Epictetus the Stoic. So that after we have done our best regarding things external to us, everything that is lacking for us to succeed is, from our point of view, absolutely impossible. And this alone seemed to me sufficient to prevent me in the future from desiring anything but what I was to acquire, thus to make me contented. Achieve contentment by limiting desire to what we can attain. Again, very, very stoical. For our will tending by nature to desire only what our understanding represents to it as somehow possible, it is certain that if we consider all the goods that are outside us as equally beyond our power, very much like the Enchiridion of Epictetus the Stoic, very much like Seneca, if we modify our judgments so that we don't think we can achieve what we can't, then we can control our desires and always be contented with whatever we do achieve. Where was I? We will have no more regrets about lacking those that seem owed to us as our birthright when we are deprived of them through no fault of our own than we have in not possessing the kingdoms of China or Mexico, etc. If we can control our desires by controlling our thoughts, we will never be disappointed. You're not disappointed at not being Emperor of Mexico, are you? Well, if you can learn to be content with having done your best and not achieving anything else, then you can be just as content with whatever you end up with, even if it's crushing poverty. Just as content with crushing poverty as you are now with not being Emperor of Mexico. This is, again, a very stoic view. I got to wrap this up in a hurry because my phone battery can't take much more recording. So we'll have to get to his final code of his final maxim in the next video. Let's see what I shall say to summarize this. He references the limits prescribed to us by nature. That sounds like Epicurus. He talks about philosophers who in earlier times were able to free themselves from fortune's domination. Again, very classical, very stoic. References to Epicureanism as well. And who, despite sorrows and poverty, could rival their gods in happiness. That's very, very much a reference to Epicurus. And in short, this third principle is a tribute to the ancient medieval tradition, but this is perhaps only a temporary tribute to the ancient medieval tradition. Whether any of this remains in the ethical teaching of Descartes himself will be determined by whether he can restore this particular brick in the new house of knowledge, whether he can base this principle of controlling yourself rather than fortune, align your desires to reality, don't try to do it vice versa, whether he can build that principle on any new foundation for knowledge he finds in part 4 of the discourse will determine whether any of this is a permanent principle. Maybe it's only a provisional code of morals. Well, it is provisional, but maybe he won't keep it at all. We shall have to see. Thanks for watching.